Does it not actually contradict item G, which is access to emergency care? Is you have to discontinue a treatment process?
Well, the whole process of emergency means that it is something out of the ordinary. And so they're not inconsistent. Emergency means regardless of whatever else is going on, if someone is coming in with an emergency, you have a responsibility to at least intervene. And even when there's collective bargaining or strike actions, although it gets muddied up, but one of the critical areas that even public hospitals and treating professionals continue to pay attention to is urgent care. And that's typically what the case is when there's an emergency. And in any case, the nature of an emergency is that you're probably not looking for a specialist or a consultant at that time. It's good to have one and to go to exactly where the specialists are. But many times when there's an emergency, you just want to get to the nearest possible place where you can get some quick intervention to stabilize a patient. And many general physicians are actually able to provide that initial intervention.
How do you take care of the concerns of funding this laudable project of yours? Because you know you're dealing with people, you're dealing with hospitals, both private and government hospitals, and indeed the personnel that are inside.
Well, I'm going to split that into two. There's a funding requirement for propagating the patient Bill of Rights. With respect to that, what we would looking to do is to continue to work with all our collaborators to make sure that we carry this information all the way through. One of the things the Consumer Protection Council is considering doing is writing guidelines around the patient's Bill of Rights to ensure that hospitals and medical facilities themselves carry on the responsibility of making sure that this is pasted in different languages and in places where patients and their families can see them, and to also continue to train their personnel. Now, if what you're talking about is that would enforcing these rights or complying with these rights not potentially create a burden on hospitals with respect to patients who might be unable to afford care, that's also provided for in the Patient's Bill of Rights, in the sense that other than emergency care, patients recognize their obligation to pay. And so one of the potential areas where there could be service disruption is, for instance, if it gets to a point where patient is unable to pay anymore, then you're looking for the best possible alternative where that patient can continue to be cared for in a facility where the burden of payment might not necessarily be the same. But beyond anything else, I think the two things that are most important here is that doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals in hospitals need to recognize what their obligations are to patients. They need to recognize that they're in the business of saving lives. They need to recognize that in this profession, the margin of error is zero. And patients also need to recognize that the only reason why these facilities exist and are able to serve them when they're commercial locations is that they're paid. And so all of that balance is provided for within the document. And I think as we work hard, if we all have a common purpose of working hard to respect these rights, both from patients respecting the rights and observing their obligations to treating professionals, and professionals respecting their obligations to the patients, I think we'll find a balance that does not materially affect the commercial outcomes of hospitals, which I recognize are businesses many times.
Now, also under item I, which is patient's refusal of care, how will this play out, for instance, in severe, should I say, extreme cases of a patient wanting to give up the ghost? And, for instance, say you have some very troubling ailments and the patient doesn't want to go ahead with treatment, just say that, okay, just let me go. I've had it to this point. How do you deal with that kind of scenario?
Well, that's a good question. And that's why, I mean, ultimately, it is a matter of law and professional ethics that the patient controls the course of their own treatment. They must be able to make ultimate final decisions for themselves. The only thing is that those decisions must be based on clear information and presented with the alternatives or the potential outcome of the different options they have. However, to the extent supported by law, patients will still be able to make those decisions. And that's why the language in the Patient's Bill of Rights is to the extent supported by law. So sometimes as a matter of faith, you choose that you do not want blood transfusion. That must be respected. Now, if euthanasia, for instance, is against the law in Nigeria, so you have someone who wants to end his own life in a manner that violates the law, then in which case the treating professionals must comply with the law and do whatever it takes to preserve that life.
Well, Mr. Ugera, people go through a lot, and so many will look to this and welcome it and hope that, it really does work at the end of the day. But I'm just wondering if you could shed some more light on the workability of this, because many times they'll tell you get to the hospital or at the point they're dispensing some medication, they just write those medications or the prescriptions. They don't even let you see which ones exactly, so that you could refer to it in cases of emergency, or the conduct of practitioners. It could be the nurses, even the doctors themselves. Some of them think it's way below par. How is this going to work in terms of coordinating between the Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria and several other agencies, such that they have a smooth coordination and making this work?
Thank you. And one of the key issues I continue to consider as we went through this process was enforceability. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that truly, really modifies human behavior is consequence. And so that's why the regulators, the disciplinary authorities for each of the professions in the healthcare ecosystem were vital to the conversation. And we're continuing those conversations with them. The one thing about rights is really that what really improves compliance with people's rights is that people demand those rights. And so the first step is for this educational material to be out there and for people to know it and demand those rights and report when something goes wrong. And so if the consumer side of reporting when there are violations occur, and then we would be able to create the pressure on the disciplinary or the regulatory side to make sure that interventions that address what those problems are managed. One of the things we're doing at the Consumer Protection Council is to support that process, in the sense that we would harvest complaints, we would analyze them, and we would engage the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Medical and Dental Council, the Medical Laboratory Scientists Council, and all those organizations or the institutions that are responsible for licensing and discipline, and make sure, and we would hold them accountable also, to make sure that the disciplinary processes are occurring and they're happening in a prompt manner and in a transparent manner. And once we begin to see a few cases where there's discipline, I'm sure that professions would begin to behave differently.
It's a huge one. I dare say you've got a job of work to do with this, alongside several other teams that will be working on this one.